Now, opposition lawmakers and conservative commentators are critical of Mr. Obama on many issues, and some say it is driven by racism as much as political differences. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter has risen to Mr. Obama's defense. He says that some Americans oppose Mr. Obama because they do not feel an African American should be president. Mr. Obama has refused to answer questions about Mr. Carter's remarks, but his press secretary says the president believes the protests are not over race, but his policies. Mr. Carter raised the issue twice this week, most recently at a public meeting in Atlanta, Georgia. Here's what he had to say.
When a radical fringe element of demonstrators and others began to attack the President of the United States of America as an animal, or as a reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, or when they waved signs in the air that said we should have buried Obama with Kennedy. Those kind of things are beyond the bounds of the way presidents have ever been accepted, even with people who disagree. And I think people that are guilty of that kind of personal attack against Obama have been influenced to a major degree by a belief that he should not be president because he happens to be African American. It's a racist attitude.
Now, joining us now to discuss Mr. Carter's charges and the debate over President Obama's policies is VOA national correspondent Jim Malone. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Ndimyake.
Well, of course, this has been really the talk of the nation after Mr. Carter said what he did. Where would you say the truth really lies? Is it what Mr. Obama says, that his policies, or what Mr. Carter says, that it's racism?
This is one of those stories that's a bit in the eye of the beholder, if you will, Ndimyake. What President Carter said was that, in his opinion, the overwhelming driving force, really, behind the opposition to President Obama on health care and other issues is racism. So it's really a question of degree. I think we definitely have seen, for example, some of the protesters carrying signs that one could interpret as racist during a recent conservative march in Washington. But the question is racism really the overall driving force? And I have to say there's quite a debate about that. What you hear from these protesters generally is they don't like big government. They don't want to be overly taxed. They don't want too much government control of their health care. That seems to me to be driving this debate more than anything else. But we do have, for example, some of the black members of Congress who charge that racism is very much a part of this debate, and it's always simmering just underneath the surface.
Now, of course, Mr. Carter is often referred to as a very controversial and polarizing figure, but this issue of race is really one of those secrets or one of those statements that should never be made publicly. But when you think that Mr. Obama himself had to do it before he became president, is this something that maybe should be discussed?
Absolutely, but you know, we should also go back to the campaign and remember that candidate Barack Obama always was pretty effective at sort of, veering away from direct discussions of race unless he absolutely had to. He wanted to kind of avoid that. And in fact, this week, reporters at the White House have been peppering the White House spokesman Robert Gibbs about this issue, about whether race is the driving force. And I think we have some of what the press secretary had to say.
Now, Jim, some of Mr. Obama's harshest critics have been very conservative commentators. One person who comes to mind is the TV host of the Fox cable show, Glenn Beck. This is what he had to say back in July.
This president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture. I don't know what.
So how do you think people should react to that?
Well, of course, that was said some time ago. It has made the rounds on blogs and the internet, and of course it fuels those on the Democratic side who do see race as a big issue here. On the other hand, it's a question of proportion. How much of that do you hear? It tends to be isolated, but again, many people do see this under the surface. And again, I bring us back to the White House reaction, which is to downplay all of this, and the press secretary, Robert Gibbs.
Now, of course, Jim, really, when you look at it over time, Mr. Obama is not the only person or the only president president who's been heavily criticized for a lot of issues that he's undertaken. I mean, in previous years, the issue of immigration, health reform, and of course, President Obama is being accused also of, just really enlarging government. When you look at the comparisons that it has happened in the past, how does one make a distinction between whether it's racially charged or really it's just, as people say, policies?
Well, it's a good question, because if you were to talk to former President Bill Clinton, he would talk about how right-wing extremists sort of got energized during his presidency. At the same time, President George W. Bush, a Republican, faced a lot of strident criticism from liberal Democrats. In one sense, it comes with the territory. Certainly, though, when we have a Democratic president, it does seem to be sort of an agitating force for right-wing elements, the militias, and sort of anti-government types to speak out. That's what I think we're seeing in recent months. They're focused on the health care issue as a way, and President Obama as sort of targets in a way to complain about big government, too much government control, which I really think at the bottom is at the heart of this, as well as fear of change. A lot of people see some big changes possibly coming in terms of health care and other issues. They fear that, and the fear drives people into the streets sometimes.
Now, of course, we haven't heard personally directly from Mr. Obama himself, but I want to play a clip from his press secretary, Robert Gibbs. This is what he had to say.
As I said Sunday, the president does not believe that this is based on the color of his skin.
Now, what do you think, Jim? Should President Obama at this point weigh in? What should we expect?
Probably, we've heard from the press secretary. I think that's the extent of what we're going to hear. I don't think the president wants to engage in this issue on a personal level. It's also a distraction from what he's trying to do. Don't forget, this health care plan is the signature piece of his presidency so far. He has a lot riding on this politically in the United States. It's going to affect everything else he does. So we have to watch how he performs on that issue very closely, and how he deals with this mounting criticism and the dropping poll ratings that we've seen over the last several weeks.
Jim Malone, national correspondent for VOA. It's always good talking with you.
Same here. Thank you.
All right, take care.